The Broken Wheel Saloon sat like a rotting tooth in the mouth of Copper Ridge, its weathered batwing doors hanging crooked on rusted hinges. Late afternoon sun slanted through grimy windows, casting amber light across scarred tables where desperate men nursed warm beer and broken dreams. The air hung thick with tobacco smoke and the bitter scent of spilled whiskey, while somewhere in the corner a piano wheezed out a funeral dirge. Jake Morrison owned this place now, though not through any legal deed. Iron Hand Morrison, they called him, on account of the steel prosthetic that had replaced his left hand after a dynamite accident in his younger, stupider days. The metal fingers could crush a man's windpipe or snap bones like kindling, and Morrison never tired of demonstrating this fact. He sat sprawled across two chairs at the saloon's center table, his massive frame draped in an expensive black coat that had probably belonged to someone else until very recently. Four men flanked him, each one a walking advertisement for violence and poor life choices. The locals had learned to make themselves scarce when Morrison held court. The handful of patrons who remained hunched over their drinks like wounded animals, eyes fixed firmly on the amber liquid in their glasses. Nobody wanted to draw attention from the man who had turned Copper Ridge into his personal kingdom of fear. That's when the stranger pushed through the batwing doors. He looked like winter given human form, all gray hair and weathered skin stretched over sharp bones. 70 years if he was a day, maybe more, with pale blue eyes that reminded folks of January mornings when the frost bit deep. His clothes were clean but worn thin from too many years and too many miles, the kind of simple brown wool and faded cotton that spoke of a man who had long ago stopped caring about impressing anyone. A battered hat sat crooked on his silver head, casting shadows across a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in the weather to age. But it was the gun that caught Morrison's attention. The old man wore it low on his right hip in a cracked leather holster that had seen better decades. The weapon itself looked like something dug up from a battlefield, its metal surface covered in dark stains that could have been rust or something considerably worse. The handle was worn smooth from countless hands, and when the stranger moved, the gun seemed to settle against his leg like an old friend returning home after a long journey. Morrison's laughter started as a low rumble in his chest before exploding into a sound like breaking glass. Well now, boys, look what the desert wind blew in. His voice carried the lazy confidence of a man who had never met consequences he couldn't buy, bully, or bury. An old man with an old gun, probably older than Moses and twice as useless. The stranger's pale eyes swept the room once, taking in every face, every weapon, every possible exit. He moved to the bar with careful steps, each one deliberate and measured. The barmaid, a pretty girl named Sarah with kind eyes and calloused hands, set down the glass she had been polishing and approached with obvious reluctance. "What can I get you, mister? Coffee if you have it. Water if you don't." Morrison's boots hit the floor with a sound like a judge's gavel. "You hear that, boys? Coffee. Like he's planning to stay for breakfast." The four men around him chuckled on cue, though their laughter held the hollow ring of fear trying to pass itself off as amusement. Morrison pushed back from his table and stood to his full height, 6.5 feet of muscle and malice wrapped in black cloth. "Tell me, old-timer, you planning to drink that coffee before or after you explain what business you have in my town? I wasn't aware towns could be owned by men like you," the stranger replied without turning around. Sarah's hands trembled as she poured steaming coffee into a chipped ceramic mug. The old man's voice carried no challenge, no heat, just a simple statement of fact delivered in tones as flat and cold as a tombstone. But before you find out what happens next, if you're enjoying this story of legends and justice, hit that like button. If you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to join us for more tales of the frontier. Comment below and let me know what country you're listening from. I love seeing how these stories reach folks all around the world. Now, stay with me because what's coming next will surprise you. Morrison's face darkened like a thundercloud gathering strength. "Men like me?" His voice rose an octave, the casual menace replaced by genuine anger. "You got something you want to say about men like me, Grandpa?" The stranger lifted the coffee mug to his lips and took a careful sip. Steam rose from the dark liquid, creating small clouds that dissipated in the stale saloon air. Just that towns belong to the people who live in them, not the people who terrorize them. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Morrison's men shifted in their chairs, hands drifting toward weapons with the unconscious precision of predators sensing prey. One of them, a scarred man with dead eyes named Dutch, actually stood up and placed his hand on the butt of his Remington. The local patrons suddenly found urgent reasons to be elsewhere, coins hitting tables as they fled through the back door like rabbits before a wildfire. Morrison's steel fingers flexed with a sound like grinding gears. "You know what I think, old man? I think you wandered into the wrong saloon on the wrong day. I think maybe that rusty piece of junk on your hip has made you forget your manners. Maybe I should take it off your hands, put it somewhere safe, like the bottom of the creek." The stranger set his coffee cup down with infinite care, the ceramic making the smallest possible sound against the scarred wood of the bar. He still hadn't turned around, but Sarah could see his reflection in the mirror behind the bottles, and what she saw there made her blood run cold. The old man's eyes had changed, gone from pale blue to something resembling winter ice over a deep lake. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quality that made grown men remember childhood fears of things that hunted in the dark. "That gun hasn't been fired in 15 years. But some things you never forget. Some skills stay with you long after you wish they would fade away." Morrison took 3 steps forward, his expensive boots echoing on the wooden floor like the countdown to an execution. His steel hand reached toward the stranger's shoulder with casual arrogance. "Then maybe it's time you remembered what it feels like to be afraid, old man." But the moment those metal fingers made contact with the weathered wool of the stranger's coat, everything in the Broken Wheel Saloon changed forever. The stranger's body went perfectly still under Morrison's grip, like a coiled spring waiting for release. For a heartbeat, the saloon hung in crystalline silence, broken only by the distant sound of wind rattling loose shutters. Then the old man turned around. Morrison found himself staring into eyes that belonged in a graveyard, pale and cold and utterly without mercy. The stranger's face had transformed from aged weariness into something carved from winter stone, all sharp angles and dangerous shadows. When he spoke, his voice carried the whisper of distant thunder. "Take your hand off me." Morrison's steel fingers tightened their grip, leaving dents in the wool fabric. Around them, his 4 men rose from their chairs with the synchronized precision of wolves circling wounded prey. Dutch positioned himself behind the stranger, while the other 3 spread out to block any escape routes. The scarred gunman's hand never left his weapon, fingers drumming against leather in a rhythm that spoke of barely contained violence. "Or what, old-timer?" Morrison's breath reeked of whiskey and rotting teeth. "You gonna shoot me with that museum piece? Hell, I bet it hasn't been cleaned since Lincoln was president. Probably blow up in your face if you try to fire it." The stranger's gaze never wavered from Morrison's face, but something shifted behind those winter eyes. For just a moment, memory flickered across his features like shadows dancing in firelight. Distant scenes played behind his weathered features, ghostly images that belonged to another lifetime, when his hair was dark and his hands were steady and the weight of 47 graves hadn't yet settled on his shoulders. A dusty street at high noon, 2 men facing each other while a town held its breath. The thunder crack of gunfire echoing off false-fronted buildings. A young outlaw falling backward into the dirt, surprise frozen on his face as crimson spread across his chest. Another memory, darker still, a back-alley ambush in Tombstone where 3 men had tried to collect the bounty on his head. They had underestimated him too, dismissed him as just another aging lawman past his prime. Their mistake had painted the alley walls with testament to the folly of assumption. The gun at his hip seemed to pulse with malevolent life, as if it remembered those moments when steel and gunpowder had spoken the final word in disputes that could not be settled with conversation. 40 years of use had stained the metal dark with more than rust, had seasoned it with the iron-rich tang of spilled blood and final breaths. Each stain told a story. Each mark represented a man who had made the fatal error of forcing violence upon someone who understood its language far too well. "I'm asking you nicely," the stranger said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Let go." Morrison's laugh boomed through the saloon like a dynamite blast. "You threatening me, Grandpa? You and what army?" His free hand gestured toward his men, who had closed their circle tighter around the bar. "In case you can't count, there's 5 of us and 1 of you." And that one looks like he should be in a rocking chair somewhere, telling war stories to his grandchildren. Sarah backed away from the confrontation, her face pale as fresh snow. She had worked in frontier saloons long enough to recognize the particular quality of silence that preceded bloodshed, the way the air itself seemed to thicken with approaching violence. Her fingers found the edge of a heavy serving tray, not much of a weapon, but better than nothing if the situation deteriorated further. The stranger's posture began to change in subtle ways that only a trained eye would notice. His weight shifted from his back foot to his front, creating a more stable platform for sudden movement. His right shoulder dropped half an inch, bringing his gun hand into perfect alignment with the weapon at his hip. Most telling of all, his breathing slowed to the deep, controlled rhythm of a man preparing for action. Dutch decided to contribute his own brand of intimidation to the proceedings. He stepped closer behind the stranger, close enough that his breath ghosted across the old man's neck. Maybe we should just take that gun away from him, boss. Put it out of its misery. Probably doing the poor thing a favor. That's when Morrison made his crucial mistake. His steel hand released its grip on the stranger's shoulder only to snake around Sarah's waist, pulling her against his massive frame with casual brutality. The girl's gasp of fear and pain cut through the saloon's tension like a blade. Look here, old man. You got two choices. You can hand over that antique peacefully and walk out of here with all your bones still connected, or you can watch me demonstrate what these steel fingers can do to pretty little necks. The change in the stranger was immediate and terrifying. Every muscle in his body went taut as piano wire, and his pale eyes flared with an inner fire that seemed to burn straight through to Morrison's soul. The temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees, and even the bravest of Morrison's men took an involuntary step backward. Mister, you just made the worst mistake of your life. From his shadowed corner table, an ancient cowboy named Pete Hawkins felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. He had been nursing the same glass of beer for 2 hours, hoping to avoid Morrison's attention, but now he found himself transfixed by the scene unfolding before him. Something about the stranger's profile nagged at his memory, something familiar in the set of those shoulders and the particular way he held his head. Pete had been riding these territories for nigh on 50 years, had rubbed shoulders with every breed of dangerous man the frontier could produce. Outlaws and lawmen, bounty hunters and gunfighters, soldiers and scouts, and everything in between. But there was something about this particular stranger that made his skin crawl with recognition, like trying to remember a half-forgotten nightmare. The gun, Pete realized with growing horror. He had seen that weapon before, years ago, hanging from the hip of a man whose name was spoken in whispers across 3 territories. A federal marshal whose reputation had grown so dark that even hardened killers would cross the street to avoid meeting his pale blue eyes. The stains on the metal weren't rust at all, Pete understood now. They were something far more permanent, something that had soaked into the steel itself during years of lethal service. Sweet Jesus, Pete whispered under his breath, his weathered hands beginning to shake. It can't be. He died years ago. Everyone said he died. But as the stranger's hand drifted down toward his weapon with the fluid grace of a striking snake, Pete Hawkins knew with absolute certainty that some legends never truly die. They just wait in the shadows, biding their time, until some fool makes the mistake of threatening an innocent in their presence. The last thing Pete remembered thinking before all hell broke loose was a prayer for Morrison's soul, because he was about to meet the one man on earth who could send it straight to judgment. Pete Hawkins lurched to his feet with a speed that belied his 73 years, his chair clattering backward onto the saloon floor. His face had gone white as cemetery marble, and his hands shook so violently that beer sloshed over the rim of his glass to splash across the scarred wooden table. Holy Mother of God, Pete breathed, his voice carrying across the tense silence like a death knell. Frank Lawson. The name hit the room like a physical blow. Dutch's hand froze halfway to his gun, and 2 of Morrison's other men actually took a step backward despite themselves. Even Morrison's grip on Sarah loosened slightly as the blood drained from his face. That name carried weight in these territories, the kind of weight that could crush a man's courage and leave him hollow inside. Frank Deadeye Lawson. The stranger didn't acknowledge Pete's recognition, but something in his posture confirmed the old cowboy's worst fears. His right hand hung loose at his side, fingers slightly curved in the classic gunfighter's stance that every man west of the Mississippi had heard described in whispered conversations around campfires. The transformation was complete now, the harmless old drifter completely gone, replaced by something that belonged in nightmares and cautionary tales. Pete's voice cracked as he continued, unable to stop himself from reciting the terrible catalog he had carried in his memory for decades. 47 confirmed kills over 30 years wearing a federal marshal's badge. They say he could put 6 shots through a silver dollar at 50 paces. They say he once faced down 8 men in Dodge City and walked away without a scratch. They say the last time he drew that gun, 3 bounty hunters tried to collect the price on his head, and he put all 3 in the ground before any of them could clear leather. Morrison's steel hand tightened reflexively around Sarah's waist, making her gasp in pain. But his eyes never left the stranger's face, searching for some sign that Pete's words were the ravings of a drunk old fool rather than gospel truth. What he saw there offered no comfort whatsoever. The pale blue eyes that stared back at him held the cold certainty of a man who had looked death in the face so many times that they had become old acquaintances. Dutch tried to salvage the situation with bravado that rang hollow in the suddenly frigid air. "That's impossible, boss. Deadeye Lawson died 15 years ago. Everyone knows that. Got shot up bad in some cantina down Mexico way and bled out in the desert." The stranger's voice cut through Dutch's protests like a blade through silk. "Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated. I retired from federal service in 1874 after my last official assignment. 3 bounty hunters named Briggs, Cahill, and Santo. They cornered me in an alley behind the Alhambra Saloon in Tombstone. Figured they could collect the $5,000 bounty that certain interested parties had placed on my head." Frank's hand moved to rest on the grip of his weapon, and every man in the saloon felt his heart skip a beat. The gun seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, as if it were a living thing that had tasted blood and found the flavor to its liking. The dark stains on the metal caught the amber light filtering through the grimy windows, and suddenly nobody in the room could pretend those marks were anything as innocent as rust. "They were wrong about the bounty," Frank continued in that same flat, emotionless tone. "And they were wrong about their chances. Briggs got off 1 shot that creased my ribs before I put 2 bullets through his heart. Cahill was fast, faster than most, but not fast enough to beat 40 years of practice. Santo tried to run when he saw his partners fall, but you don't turn your back on a fight and expect to walk away." The stranger's pale eyes focused on Morrison with laser intensity. "The blood you see on this gun isn't from 1 man or 2 or 3. It's from every man who ever made the mistake of forcing violence on someone who didn't deserve it. Every outlaw who thought an old badge meant nothing. Every killer who figured age had made me soft. Every piece of human garbage who threatened innocence and figured there wouldn't be consequences." Sarah whimpered as Morrison's grip tightened further, but she couldn't take her eyes off the legendary gunfighter standing at the bar. Stories of Deadeye Lawson had been told and retold across the frontier for decades, growing in the telling until they took on the quality of folk tales. But here he stood in flesh and blood, and the reality was somehow more terrifying than any campfire story could ever be. Morrison's voice cracked when he tried to speak, betraying the fear he was desperately trying to conceal. "You're bluffing, old man. You may have been something once upon a time, but that was a lifetime ago. You're past your prime, and we've got the girl. You try anything, and she dies." Frank's transformation continued before their eyes, like watching winter claim a landscape in fast motion. His shoulders straightened, adding inches to his apparent height. His weathered face seemed to harden into granite, every line and scar becoming more pronounced. Most unsettling of all, his pale eyes began to glow with an inner fire that spoke of violence held barely in check. The few remaining patrons fled through whatever exits they could find, abandoning drinks and dignity in their haste to escape the approaching carnage. The bartender ducked behind his counter with the practiced ease of a man who had survived previous demonstrations of frontier justice. Even the piano seemed to sense the danger, its off-key melody dying away to leave only the sound of heavy breathing and creaking floorboards. Pete Hawkins backed toward the door on unsteady legs, but he couldn't resist sharing one final piece of the legend. They say he trained some of the most famous guns in the West. John Wesley Hardin consulted with him about draw techniques. Wild Bill Hickok himself said Frank Lawson was the only man alive who could outdraw him consistently. And they say, Pete's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, they say that when Deadeye Lawson sets his mind to killing a man, that man is already dead. He just doesn't know it yet. Morrison's gang shifted nervously, their earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew under a desert sun. The smart ones among them were already calculating distances to doors and windows, weighing their loyalty to Morrison against their chances of surviving the next few minutes. Dutch alone seemed determined to see this through, his scarred face set in lines of grim resolve. Frank stepped away from the bar with fluid grace, his movements economical and precise. Every step was measured, every gesture deliberate. He no longer looked like an old man playing at being dangerous. He looked like death incarnate, walking the earth in search of souls to collect. Morrison, Frank said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence, you have threatened an innocent woman in my presence. You have used violence to terrorize a community that cannot defend itself. You have chosen to make this personal when you could have simply walked away. The steel-handed outlaw tried to retreat, dragging Sarah backward toward the saloon's rear exit, but his movements were clumsy with panic. His men formed a protective barrier between their boss and the legendary gunfighter, but their hearts weren't in it anymore. They had signed on to intimidate shopkeepers and farmers, not to face down the most dangerous man in 3 territories. Frank's hand hovered over his weapon like a benediction waiting to be delivered. In the space of a heartbeat, Morrison suddenly understood that he had cornered something far more dangerous than an aging drifter. He had awakened a sleeping legend, and now that legend was preparing to remind the world why some names became immortal. Let the girl go, and I'll give you 30 seconds to clear out of this town forever. Stay, and I'll give you the same chance I gave Briggs, Cahill, and Santo. Morrison's steel fingers dug into Sarah's side hard enough to bruise, but his voice betrayed the desperation behind his bravado. You're not taking her from me, old man. Not today, not ever. She's my insurance policy now. Frank's pale eyes grew even colder, and when he spoke again, his words carried the weight of absolute certainty. Then you just signed your own death warrant. The tension in the Broken Wheel saloon stretched taut as piano wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Morrison's steel fingers dug deeper into Sarah's ribs, drawing a sharp cry of pain that cut through the silence like a knife blade. His eyes darted between his 4 remaining men and the legendary gunfighter who stood motionless as carved stone, waiting for someone to make the first fatal mistake. Take him down, Morrison roared, his voice cracking with desperation and rage. All of you now. Kill him before he kills us all. Dutch was the first to move, his scarred hand streaking toward the Remington at his hip with practiced speed. He was fast, faster than most men who made their living with a gun, but as his fingers closed around the weapon's grip, he made a discovery that would haunt his final seconds on Earth. Frank Lawson hadn't just been fast in his prime. Even 15 years past retirement, even with silver hair and weathered hands, he was still faster than death itself. Frank's draw was poetry written in gunpowder and lead, a symphony of destruction conducted by fingers that remembered every lesson violence had ever taught them. The ancient Colt seemed to leap into his hand of its own accord, the worn grip settling into his palm like it had been carved specifically for his fingers. 40 years of muscle memory guided the movement, transforming an old man into an instrument of precise and terrible justice. The first shot echoed through the saloon like the crack of divine judgment. Dutch's Remington had barely cleared leather when Frank's bullet took him in the right shoulder, spinning him around like a child's top before dropping him to the sawdust-covered floor. The shot had been surgical in its precision, designed to disable rather than kill, but the message was unmistakable. Frank Lawson could have ended Dutch's life as easily as snuffing a candle, and everyone in the room knew it. The second gunman, a thick-built desperado named Crenshaw, tried to take advantage of Frank's apparent mercy. He charged forward with a Bowie knife in each hand, figuring to get close enough that superior reach and youth would carry the day. It was the kind of tactic that had worked against slower, older opponents in the past, but Frank Lawson was not like any opponent Crenshaw had ever faced. Frank's second shot shattered Crenshaw's right kneecap with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, dropping the big man to the floor in a writhing heap of agony. Before Crenshaw could even process what had happened to his leg, Frank had stepped sideways with fluid grace, putting himself at an angle where Morrison couldn't use Sarah as an effective human shield. The third man, a nervous kid named Billy who couldn't have been more than 20, realized he was watching the systematic destruction of everything he had thought he knew about gunfighting. His hands shook so violently that he dropped his own weapon without firing a shot, raising his palms in surrender as tears streamed down his dirt-stained cheeks. "I yield," he sobbed, his voice breaking like a child's. "Please don't kill me, mister. I never wanted to hurt nobody. Morrison made us do it." Frank's pale eyes flicked to the trembling youth, and for just a moment, something almost resembling compassion flickered in their icy depths. "Get out of here, boy. Find yourself a different line of work before you end up like your friends." Billy scrambled toward the door on hands and knees, too terrified to stand upright, leaving only Morrison and his lieutenant, a cold-eyed killer named Santana, who had been content to let the others test the legendary gunfighter's skills. Santana was different from the rest, older and more experienced, with the calculating patience of a professional rather than the hot-blooded recklessness of common outlaws. Santana moved with deliberate slowness, his hands spread wide to show he wasn't reaching for a weapon. His voice carried the measured tones of a man who understood exactly how much danger he was in. "You're Frank Lawson, sure enough. I've heard the stories, and I believe every word of them now. But here's the thing about stories, Lawson. They always leave out the important details." Frank kept his weapon trained on the space between Santana and Morrison, ready to engage whichever threat moved first. His breathing remained deep and controlled, showing no signs of the exertion that should have accompanied such precise shooting under pressure. "This is where you tell me you're different from the others, is that it?" Santana smiled, and there was nothing pleasant about the expression. "I'm different because I know something you don't know about your old friend Jake Morrison here. See, Jake's got himself a dead man's switch built into that steel hand of his. You kill him, you wound him. Hell, you make him flinch wrong, and those metal fingers are going to close up tight around the girl's throat. Snap her neck neat as you please." Morrison's triumphant grin spread across his sweat-slicked face like a disease. "That's right, old man. This hand operates on a spring mechanism. Anything happens to me, anything at all, and it clamps shut with enough force to crush a man's skull. So what's it going to be, legend? You going to be responsible for an innocent girl's death just to settle an old score?" Frank's expression never changed, but something shifted behind his pale eyes, like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon. He had faced impossible choices before, had been forced to make calculations where innocent lives hung in the balance against the greater good. Those decisions had carved lines into his weathered face and stolen sleep from countless nights, but they had never broken his resolve. Sarah struggled in Morrison's grip, her face flushed red from the pressure of the steel fingers around her ribs, but she managed to gasp out words that cut through the tension like a blade. "Don't worry about me, mister. Some things are more important than one person's life." Her courage struck Frank like a physical blow, reminding him of another time, another place, when someone equally brave had made an equally impossible choice. A young woman in a dusty border town who had thrown herself between Frank and an assassin's bullet, trading her life for his because she believed in the justice he represented. He had carried the weight of that sacrifice for 15 years, and he would be damned if he would let another innocent pay the price for his past. Frank's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "Santana, you made one crucial mistake in your calculations. You assumed I care more about avoiding bloodshed than I do about stopping men like you from terrorizing innocent people." The legendary gunfighter began to move then, not with the desperate speed of a young man trying to prove himself, but with the calculated precision of a craftsman who had spent decades perfecting his art. Every step was measured, every angle calculated, every movement designed to create the exact scenario he needed to end this confrontation on his terms. Santana went for his gun first, recognizing the approaching moment when talk would give way to action. He was skilled, perhaps skilled enough to have been dangerous in his prime, but Frank Lawson in motion was like watching a force of nature at work. The ancient Colt roared twice in quick succession, the first bullet taking Santana in the chest, the second ensuring he would never threaten another innocent soul. Morrison's steel hand began to tighten around Sarah's throat in reflexive response to the gunfire. But Frank had anticipated this move from the moment Santana had revealed the mechanism's existence. The old gunfighter's third shot was the most precise of his career, a bullet that struck the spring mechanism at exactly the right angle to jam the deadly fingers in place before they could complete their lethal compression. Sarah twisted free from Morrison's suddenly useless grip, stumbling away from her captor with gasping breaths that sounded like hymns of thanksgiving. Morrison stared at his malfunctioned hand in disbelief, unable to comprehend how anyone could make such an impossible shot under such impossible circumstances. Frank advanced on the outlaw leader with steady, measured steps, his pale eyes reflecting the lamplight like chips of Arctic ice. Morrison tried to back away, but found himself pressed against the saloon's rear wall with nowhere left to run. His good hand fumbled for the backup pistol he kept tucked behind his belt, but his fingers shook so badly he could barely manage to grip the weapon. "You want to know the real difference between legends and ordinary men, Morrison?" Frank's voice carried the quiet authority of absolute certainty. "Legends don't quit when the situation gets impossible. They make the impossible look easy." Morrison finally managed to draw his backup weapon, a short-barreled revolver that had served him well in close-quarters fighting. But as he brought it to bear on the approaching gunfighter, he discovered the final lesson that Frank Lawson had to teach. Speed was only part of what made a legendary gunman legendary. The other part was the absolute certainty that came from 40 years of being right when it mattered most. Frank's fourth shot of the engagement took Morrison's backup gun clean out of his hand, the bullet striking the cylinder with enough force to shatter metal and send fragments spinning across the saloon floor. Morrison stood frozen against the wall, his good hand torn and bleeding from the impact, while Frank's smoking Colt pointed directly at his heart. The saloon fell silent except for the labored breathing of wounded men and the distant sound of wind rattling loose shutters. Frank stood motionless as a statue, his weapon trained on Morrison's center mass, while the outlaw leader finally understood that he was facing something far beyond his ability to comprehend or overcome. "You killed them," Morrison whispered, his voice hollow with shock and disbelief. "You killed my men." Frank's expression remained carved from winter stone. "They chose their path the moment they decided to terrorize innocent people, just like you're about to choose yours." The legendary gunfighter's pale eyes fixed on Morrison's face with laser intensity, and in that gaze the outlaw saw his own death reflected like images in still water. The moment had come for final accounts to be settled, and Jake Ironhand Morrison suddenly understood that all his years of intimidation and violence had led him to this single point where legends and reality intersected in gunpowder and justice. Morrison pressed his back against the saloon wall like a cornered animal, his steel hand hanging useless at his side while blood dripped from his good hand onto the sawdust-covered floor. The backup revolver lay in pieces at his feet, its shattered remains a testament to the precision of the legendary gunfighter who stood before him. Sweat poured down Morrison's face despite the cool autumn air, and his breath came in short, panicked gasps that fogged in the lamplight. Frank holstered his weapon with deliberate ceremony, the ancient Colt sliding home into worn leather with a whisper of finality. The gesture sent a chill through Morrison's soul, because he understood what it meant. Deadeye Lawson was preparing for a formal duel, the kind of face-to-face confrontation that had made his reputation legendary across 3 territories. "You want to settle this like men, Morrison?" Frank's voice carried the cold authority of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Step away from that wall and face me proper. Give yourself the same chance I gave every other man who forced my hand." Morrison's eyes darted around the saloon, searching for any escape route that might save him from the fate bearing down like an avalanche. The rear door stood 20 feet away, but he knew he would never make it that far before Frank's bullets found their mark. The windows were boarded up against winter storms, and the main entrance might as well have been on the moon for all the good it would do him. Sarah had retreated to the far corner of the room, her hand pressed against her bruised throat while she watched the drama unfold with wide, frightened eyes. Dutch lay groaning on the floor, clutching his shattered shoulder while blood seeped between his fingers. Crenshaw had passed out from the pain of his destroyed knee, and young Billy's sobbing could still be heard fading into the distance as he fled toward whatever sanctuary he might find. Frank stepped back from the wall, moving to the center of the saloon with the fluid grace of a man who had performed this ritual more times than he cared to remember. His pale eyes never left Morrison's face, reading every flicker of expression like pages in a familiar book. Fear, desperation, rage, and the growing realization that death had finally come calling for Jake Ironhand Morrison. The legendary gunfighter's stance was perfect, feet spread shoulder-width apart, weight evenly distributed, right hand hanging loose at his side in the classic dueling position. Everything about his posture spoke of decades spent perfecting the art of single combat, of countless hours practicing the draw that had become as natural as breathing. Even 15 years past his prime, Frank Lawson moved like violence made flesh. Morrison pushed himself away from the wall with trembling legs, his good hand flexing and unflexing as he tried to work feeling back into fingers numbed by shock and terror. He had been in gunfights before, had killed men in fair duels and ambushes alike, but this was different. This was facing a legend with 47 confirmed kills, a man whose name was whispered around campfires as a warning against the wages of sin. "You don't have to do this, old man," Morrison said, his voice cracking like thin ice under pressure. "We can make a deal. I've got money hidden away, enough to make you rich for the rest of your life. Just walk away and forget you ever saw me." Frank's expression never changed, but something flickered behind his pale eyes that might have been pity. "The money you stole from innocent people? The gold you took from families trying to build new lives? That blood money doesn't interest me, Morrison. Some things can't be bought, and justice is one of them." The outlaw leader tried one last desperate gambit, his voice rising to a near shout as panic overwhelmed whatever dignity he might have possessed. "You're nothing but a killer, Lawson. A hired gun with a fancy badge who thinks he's better than the rest of us. How many men have you murdered in the name of the law? How many families have you destroyed with that gun of yours?" Frank's voice remained steady as granite when he replied, but those who knew how to listen could hear the weight of 47 graves in his words. "Every man I killed chose his path when he decided to prey on people who couldn't fight back. Every trigger I pulled was for folks like Sarah here, people trying to live decent lives in a world where men like you make that almost impossible." Morrison's good hand drifted toward the spare pistol he kept in a shoulder holster, a small hideout gun that most people never noticed. But Frank's eyes tracked the movement with the precision of a hunting hawk, and Morrison suddenly realized that the legendary gunfighter had been aware of the hidden weapon from the moment he walked into the saloon. "Don't even think about it," Frank warned, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "That little hideout piece might work on unsuspecting victims, but it won't save you from what's coming. Face me honest, Morrison. Give yourself at least that much dignity before you meet your maker." The outlaw's shoulders sagged in defeat as he realized that every trick, every advantage, every desperate scheme had been anticipated and countered by a man who had spent 30 years staying ahead of people trying to kill him. Morrison stepped away from the wall with the shuffling gait of a condemned man approaching the gallows, his steel hand hanging lifeless while his good hand trembled at his side. Frank watched Morrison assume the dueling stance with the patient attention of a craftsman examining his work. The outlaw's position was sloppy, weight too far forward, shoulders tense with fear, right hand shaking so badly that accurate shooting would be nearly impossible. It was the stance of a man who had relied on intimidation and superior numbers for so long that he had forgotten how to face an opponent on equal terms. The two men stood 15 feet apart in the amber lamplight, shadows stretching long across the sawdust floor like grasping fingers. Outside, the wind had died to almost nothing, leaving the saloon wrapped in crystalline silence broken only by Dutch's labored breathing and the distant tick of a clock somewhere in the building's depths. Morrison's eyes locked onto Frank's face, searching for some sign of weakness or hesitation that might give him an edge in the coming confrontation. What he saw there offered no comfort whatsoever. Frank Lawson's pale eyes held the cold certainty of winter itself, the absolute conviction of a man who had never lost a fair fight and didn't intend to start now. "On the count of 3, Frank said, his voice carrying the finality of a funeral bell. 1. Morrison's hand twitched toward his weapon, muscles coiled with desperate energy. His mind raced through every fast draw technique he had ever learned, every trick that had kept him alive through years of violent confrontation. But none of it seemed adequate when facing the man who had taught half the legendary gunfighters in the West how to kill efficiently. 2. The word hung in the air like a physical presence, and Morrison felt his bladder loosen slightly as the full reality of his situation crashed down upon him. He was about to die in a dusty frontier saloon, shot down by a man who had become legend while Morrison was still learning to hold a gun. All his years of terrorizing innocent people, all his dreams of building an outlaw empire, all of it would end in the next few seconds. Frank's hand moved on the count of 3, not with the desperate speed of a young man trying to prove himself, but with the measured precision of a master craftsman demonstrating his art. The ancient Colt seemed to flow into his palm like water finding its level, the worn grip settling into fingers that remembered every lesson violence had ever taught them. Morrison was fast, faster than he had any right to be given his terror and the awkwardness of his position. His revolver cleared leather in a blur of motion that would have impressed witnesses under different circumstances. But Frank Lawson in his prime had been faster than lightning, and even 15 years past retirement, he was still faster than any man Morrison had ever faced. Frank's bullet took Morrison's center mass with surgical precision, punching through his chest to find the heart that had pumped ice water instead of blood for more years than anyone could remember. The outlaw leader staggered backward, his own shot going wild to bury itself harmlessly in the ceiling beams, while crimson spread across his expensive black coat like spilled wine on velvet. Morrison looked down at the spreading stain with something approaching wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe that his reign of terror was ending in such an ordinary way. His legs gave out, and he collapsed to his knees, then pitched forward onto his face with a sound like a sack of grain hitting the ground. The feared Iron Hand Morrison was dead before his body finished settling into the sawdust. Frank stood over the corpse for a long moment, his smoking Colt still in his hand, while he studied the face of the man who had forced him back into the business of dealing death. There was no satisfaction in Morrison's death, no sense of triumph or vindication. Just the familiar weight of another grave added to the 47 that already haunted his dreams, another soul sent to judgment by the ancient weapon that had served as his constant companion for 4 decades. The saloon's batwing doors swung open with a creak of hinges, and Sheriff Tom Bradshaw stepped into the carnage with his hand resting on his own weapon. Bradshaw was young for a lawman, maybe 35, with honest eyes and the kind of steady presence that inspired confidence in troubled times. He took in the scene with practiced efficiency, cataloging the wounded, the dead, and the legendary gunfighter who stood motionless in the center of it all. "Jesus Christ," Bradshaw whispered, his voice thick with awe and recognition. "Frank Lawson, I thought you were dead." Frank holstered his weapon with the same deliberate care he had shown throughout the confrontation. "Reports of my death were exaggerated, Sheriff. I've been living quiet up in the mountains, trying to leave all this behind me. But some things follow a man whether he wants them to or not." Bradshaw's eyes swept the saloon one more time, taking note of Sarah's bruised throat, Dutch's wounded shoulder, and Morrison's still form in the spreading pool of blood. "Self-defense," he said finally, his voice carrying the authority of legal judgment. "Morrison and his gang have been terrorizing this territory for months. You did what needed doing, Marshal Lawson." The title hit Frank like a physical blow, reminding him of responsibilities he had tried to abandon and oaths he had sworn to uphold regardless of personal cost. He nodded once in acknowledgement, then turned toward the door with the slow gait of a man carrying invisible burdens too heavy for any one person to bear. Frank paused in the doorway, looking back at Sarah who stood watching him with tears streaming down her face. "Take care of yourself, miss. And remember that there are still good people in this world willing to stand up for what's right." Then he stepped out into the cool autumn evening, leaving behind another chapter in a legend that refused to stay buried no matter how far he traveled or how long he tried to hide from his past. 3 weeks after the gunfight that ended Jake Morrison's reign of terror, the town of Copper Ridge began to breathe freely for the first time in months. The Broken Wheel Saloon had been transformed from a den of fear into something approaching respectability, its windows cleaned, its floors scrubbed free of bloodstains, and its atmosphere lightened by the absence of predators who had made it their hunting ground. Sarah now owned the establishment outright, having discovered that Morrison's claim to the property had been based entirely on intimidation rather than legal documentation. The original deed still belonged to the previous owner's widow, who had been too frightened to contest Morrison's takeover until his death made such contests unnecessary. A generous settlement from Morrison's confiscated assets had made Sarah a woman of modest means, able to run her business without fear of violent interference. The most notable change in the renovated saloon hung above the bar where everyone could see it. Frank Lawson's ancient Colt Peacemaker rested in a place of honor, mounted in a glass case that Sarah had commissioned from the town's carpenter. A small brass plaque beneath the weapon bore a simple inscription that told the story more eloquently than any lengthy explanation could have managed. In memory of those who stood up when standing up mattered most. The weapon itself seemed to pulse with quiet authority even in retirement, its blood-darkened metal catching lamplight in ways that reminded observers of the man who had carried it for 40 years of faithful service. Children would press their faces against the glass and listen wide-eyed as their parents recounted the legend of Deadeye Lawson and the day justice came to Copper Ridge in the form of an elderly stranger with pale blue eyes. Frank himself had disappeared into the wilderness the morning after the confrontation, vanishing as quietly as he had arrived. Sheriff Bradshaw had offered him a deputy's position, recognizing the value of having such a legendary lawman on his side. But Frank had declined with the weary grace of a man who had already given enough of himself to the cause of justice. Some burdens, he had explained, were meant to be carried alone. The townspeople spoke of him in whispers now, adding his brief appearance to the growing collection of stories that surrounded his name. They told how he had faced down 5 armed men without hesitation, how his shots had been so precise that wounded enemies survived to face trial rather than graves. They marveled at the impossible accuracy that had jammed Morrison's steel hand mechanism, saving Sarah's life with a bullet that threaded the needle between salvation and tragedy. Pete Hawkins, the old cowboy who had recognized the legend in their midst, became something of a local celebrity himself as the man who had identified Deadeye Lawson in the flesh. He held court most evenings at his usual corner table, regaling anyone who would listen with stories of the famous gunfighter's exploits across 3 decades of frontier law enforcement. Pete's tales grew in the telling, but the core truth remained unchanged. Frank Lawson had been the most dangerous man in the West, and even in retirement, he remained a force to be reckoned with. Dutch and Crenshaw had survived their wounds and been transported to the territorial prison to await trial for their numerous crimes. Young Billy had never been seen again, presumably having taken Frank's advice about finding a different line of work. Their absence, combined with Morrison's death, had effectively ended the outlaw presence that had plagued the region for so many months. Sarah often found herself staring at the mounted weapon during quiet moments, remembering the transformation she had witnessed in the man who had carried it. She had seen Frank Lawson change from a harmless old drifter into something that belonged in legends, then back into a quiet stranger who had simply done what needed doing before disappearing into the anonymity he preferred. The memory of his pale blue eyes still gave her chills, but they were the good kind of chills that came from witnessing genuine heroism in an age when such things seemed increasingly rare. The memorial service for Morrison's victims had been held the previous Sunday, a simple ceremony that drew people from across the territory to honor those who had died under the outlaw's reign of terror. Names were read, graves were blessed, and promises were made that such violence would not be allowed to flourish again. Frank's name had not been mentioned during the official proceedings, but everyone present understood that the service had been made possible by an elderly stranger's willingness to stand up when no one else could. As winter approached and the days grew shorter, life in Copper Ridge settled into the peaceful rhythm that its residents had almost forgotten was possible. Children played in streets that had been too dangerous for such activities during Morrison's time. Merchants conducted business without fear of violent extortion. Women walked alone after dark, secure in the knowledge that monsters no longer lurked in every shadow. The legend of Deadeye Lawson lived on, burnished brighter by his brief return to action and subsequent disappearance back into the wilderness. Somewhere in the mountains north of town, an elderly man with pale blue eyes continued his quiet retirement, carrying the weight of 47 graves and the satisfaction of knowing that at least one small corner of the world was safer because he had been willing to remember who he used to be. If you enjoyed this tale of justice and hidden legends, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of the frontier. We bring you tales of courage, honor, and the price of standing up for what's right every week. Until next time, remember that heroes can be found in the most unexpected places, and sometimes the most dangerous weapon a man can carry is a reputation that refuses to stay buried. Keep your eyes open for legends walking among us, because you never know when ordinary circumstances might call for extraordinary courage.